Hey everyone, welcome back to Upside Down Data. Today I want to talk about Elrond and what its future prospects are following the collapse of FTX. Like the content or subscribe to the channel, give the video a like and follow us on Twitter. A lot of updates, better indicators, and more over there. So Elrond is an asset that we followed for a long time, and it was fortunate for Elrond, there was nothing that was explicitly linking it to FTX in any way, and that's probably partly why Elrond has held up better than some altcoins in this recent downturn. Now, obviously, Elrond did have a pretty heavy crash, from the local high there going into the FTX collapse, down 38% from kind of the top of this wick all the way to the bottom of this one. But it's not as bad as assets that had more direct exposure to, Sam Bankman-Fried and FTX. So if we look over here at Solana as an alternative, for example, Solana got absolutely destroyed in this drawdown. If we take the move for Solana here, it was down about 69% from kind of the local high before the collapse down to where we are right now. So absolutely brutal. And so when we're looking at EGLD, one of the things that's kind of interesting to note on the chart is that I've kind of entered to this kind of same zone that we ended up finding support back in the big capitulation that happened back in June. And it's just an interesting zone because there was some kind of resistance that got ran into here in the big parabolic move to the upside back in early 2021. And also roughly the same area, a little bit above, but roughly the same area that we actually found resistance on this local top that we had here back in the summer of 2020. And so that's sort of the range that's entering back into. And so what we might want to look for then moving forward is, does EGLD kind of just drift down and then keep going down out of this range? Does it kind of slice through the support that might exist here, in which case further down might be necessary to kind of find support at some of these lower levels? Or is it going to be able to do like it did back here, hold this kind of level in the high 30s, low 40s as support, and then kind of just continue this range that it's been in ever since June? Don't know, we'll have to see. One thing that's notable though about EGLD is that Bitcoin put in a lower low relative to what it did in June. EGLD has not done that yet, which is interesting. Now, I'm not going to say that means that Elrond can't go and collapse to the bottom. But if we're just talking about kind of relative strength relative to certain other assets, there's some that have not set in new lows from June, like Elrond. So, for example, ETH was like that, and then a number that have. And, you'd probably rather be in the camp that hasn't set in a new low relative to the one that has. So that's just an observation when looking at the chart here. So that's just kind of a short-term price level thing. Just watch what happens. If we start losing, the June low, and if we don't really seem to be finding much support down here, then I think lower prices are very plausible just from that more technical perspective, just looking at what's going on. But now I also want to just talk a little bit about what's going on with Elrond and just give my thoughts about kind of some more fundamental aspects or just kind of more news-based aspects. Then we're going to switch over to some of the models we have here in the channel to get us some further insight in Elrond and its price action. So one of the things that's interesting that happened recently, this is back at the beginning of the month, is that Elrond kind of announced that they were going to really start focusing more on metaverse-related products. They were kind of going to rebrand themselves to some degree to have more of a focus on metaverse. The interesting pivot, I mean, obviously a lot is going on with the metaverse space, although arguably, if you look at Meta, formerly Facebook, they've not had a whole lot of success yet. And so my kind of take on the metaverse is still incredibly early. So I don't see this as news as saying that this is just going to immediately make Elrond shoot off to the upside or anything like that. Not at all. At best, this is kind of a more long-term play that, if we get out of this crypto winter and if metaverse kind of catches on more broadly, then maybe Elrond would be positioning itself to take advantage of that down the line. But I don't think that this is going to be something that would just be an immediate kind of turnaround for Elrond. And maybe one of the reasons why Elrond's doing this is that, before when Elrond was more of just kind of marketing itself as just another layer one blockchain, kind of an ETH competitor, being faster, more scalable, that kind of thing. One of the issues there is it's a very crowded space when you're trying to do that, right? So here I am on DeFi Llama, and DeFi is one of the big use cases of layer one blockchains. Kind of that and NFTs are the two biggest things. Obviously not the only ones, tons of other unique projects that do other things on blockchains, but these are kind of the main ones. And as you can see, Ethereum is still the big dog, but let's look at all the competition of all these other, L1s that are out there that are competing for this DeFi crown. And so, Elrond's down here at number 19. Not terrible, but not fantastic either. And one of the things that I'm wondering is if the Elrond team decided that, they could continue just to try to compete with these other L1s, but that's a very difficult battle because there's so many of them, and a number of them have a head start. Look at the number of protocols on some of these other ones, whereas there's significantly fewer protocols that have been launched on Elrond for DeFi. And so maybe one of the reasons why they're trying to pivot to some degree to Metaverse is that they might see that as being less tilled ground, less competition there, especially from full-fledged L1 blockchains, somewhere where they might be able to kind of get their feet wet and maybe kind of get ahead. Now, I think the thing that's going to have to be important about that, though, is, again, any kind of pivot like this is going to take time for anything to really come of it. And so really with Elrond, what I would be looking for is, do they have the funding to maintain themselves through the bear market? Because by the looks of it, in the fallout of the FTX debacle, it's going to be a long one. Any next bull run has probably gotten delayed even further beyond what it already likely was. So, you take how bearish the macro setting has been, which was already delaying any possibility of a bull run. Now you add this very specific crypto factor where there's this huge contagion that's going on. A lot of other firms that are probably going to go belly up that were exposed to FTX. We're not looking for another bull run anytime soon. I think it's going to be in the timeline of years probably before we really see that. And so that's really going to be the question is going to be, does Elrond have a strong enough position currently to last it that entire time to eventually then benefit from things like this pivot? So, it very well could, right? Elrond's got solid tech. It's a solid project. It very well could survive, but certainly something to keep an eye on. And again, it's totally, it's not fudding to ask these questions. I think that's something that's important to say, right? That with any project, you can like the project as much as you want, but you always have to ask those tough questions, because if the answers are not good, then, the thesis might have to change. And so that's just something I think we always have to keep in mind. Okay, so let's go ahead and switch over to some of the models that we have here on the channel. So I'm going to start with the upside downside potential indicator, or UDPI. This is the long-term version. It cares about moves that play out over months to multiple months. So you can see this has done a very good job at identifying these kind of high-risk zones for EGLD, where it was likely nearing the end of its runs, or the upside was becoming limited, and then also these low-risk zones where big returns have come out of it. Now, what's interesting about what's going on right now is you'll notice we're down again in these kind of deeper green levels, kind of these lower UDPI levels like we've seen in some of these times in the past. What's interesting about what's been going on right now is we've actually been spending quite a bit more time down here than we ever have before, right? Back over here, we had this big capitulation in March 2020, and then it was just kind of a big, bull run with just some volatility, really all the way up through here until we went into this bear market. My kind of thinking in base case is that we're probably actually going to spend more time in these levels. So I'm going to flip over to the raw risk levels here. So the white line is the UDPI level across time. Yellow is the EGLD price. And again, my base case for EGLD is as best, and this is really my base case for the rest of the crypto market in general. I think EGLD is going to follow suit. The best we can hope for is just kind of sideways movement from here, right? That's kind of going to be it. And so, unless we do get some kind of flush out that maybe can catalyze some, moves back to the upside, I think we're just going to kind of range sideways here for a while, or even have to capitulate down. And I don't think necessarily a V-shaped recovery like we got in March 2020 is the most likely scenario, just because of how much more bearish the macro setting is, to say nothing of the FTX disaster. Back here, the Federal Reserve basically just decided that they were just going to support the markets as much as they needed to, just pump the markets full of liquidity. And that was one of the things that really catalyzed this crypto bull run. Not really something that's as in the cards right now, or at least the Fed isn't saying anything about doing that currently. And so that's something where if we do, even if we do get a capitulation like that, we might flush out some people, kind of change hands, the people who are less likely to sell. But then I still don't think a V-shaped recovery is likely from that. I think we probably just go sideways. And the model is actually pricing in the possibility of further downside. You can see that we're at a higher risk level now than we were back in June, even though we're at roughly the same price level. What that means is that given what the model's been seeing about this price action, it's not so convinced anymore that the downside is as limited as it was back here, currently, and actually see that there's more that's plausible. And so we have to keep that in mind, right? And so that partly goes back to what I was saying when we're looking at the price chart. We start slipping below this kind of general level of support that we are here. That's when, we might start realizing that upside of the model thinks is possible right now. Now, I should notice this, this was a pretty violent move down, almost 40%. And if we look at the short-term version of the UDPI, so this cares about moves that play out over days to weeks, so more short-term in its focus, we can see that it is actually about the same that it was in June. So basically, it's not to say that it can't keep going further, right? We still have room to the downside. But what it is suggesting is that in the shorter term, kind of days to weeks, this capitulation might just kind of lead into some consolidation before any kind of further move might happen. So, if this starts tracking back to the upside, and if we kind of stay at these lower price levels, that might be when it's a little bit more plausible for the next dump to happen. But again, Elrond is not existing in a vacuum in the crypto space. If there's some other thing that happens, some other thing that blows up or that causes a capitulation in the crypto space, I don't think EGLD is going to be protected. So this is kind of an analysis, assuming nothing crazy happens, just kind of what is likely to happen, if we just kind of think about Elrond's price action without any kind of extreme external pressures being applied to it. But I think it's reasonable that we could hold this level, that we might bounce up. But then again, if we start getting back up here, then I'm going to be a little bit more cautious again, because we've been kind of in this range on the UDPI as well, where we kind of once we get to about negative 1.5, that's kind of more or less the point we've been constantly getting rejected to the downside. I'd be watching that level closely. Now, the final indicator that I want to talk about that can give us a better sense of when we might be able to identify when EGLD's re-entering more of a bull market, or at the very least accumulation that might eventually turn into a bull market, is the momentum bias indicator, or MBI. So this is an indicator that looks at momentum, as the name suggests, and it's looking at momentum bias. Is the momentum bias to the upside? And that tends to happen, when you're above zero, that's a positive momentum bias, and that leads into these big bull movements. Or is it a negative momentum bias like we've been seeing in this bear market? And what EGLD has been doing in this bear market is textbook bear market behavior on the MBI. You see this on everything. Every asset that I've ever looked at with the MBI, you see this behavior in bear markets. Bitcoin, Ethereum, all of them will show this in bear markets, where you'll get in deep into the red in kind of the beginning of the bear market. You go all the way down deep. You come up, you try to reestablish positive momentum bias in some kind of relief rally, but then it fails. You get rejected, you move back down, and oftentimes what that'll lead into is setting in a lower low on the MBI than you had before. This is generally the way it plays out. Then you'll kind of go back up, try again to reestablish positive momentum bias, get rejected, go back down, price will come back down. You might try again, like EGLD did here. And here it was looking, possibly hopeful, right? We're actually spending a decent amount of time up in the green, but not especially so, right? It was only a slight, if anything, positive momentum bias here. And then we got rejected again. So what we might want to look for here is, do we set in a lower low again? And that would just mean that this bear market is probably going to keep going down to further legs to the downside. Or can we start doing something which I've noted multiple times on different assets, this kind of oscillation around zero, which oftentimes will mark accumulation zones. That's sort of what was happening here. Obviously the March 2020 crash is a bit of a black swan that pushed us down, but it's this kind of behavior where you're oscillating around zero. You're kind of going to a positive, then negative, then positive and negative. And generally speaking, price will kind of more or less arrange sideways, or maybe slightly in one direction or the other. But oftentimes what will happen is when you start oscillating around zero like that, it then will build up into these movements like what we saw here, where at a certain point, you'll start kind of spending more and more time in the green than in the red, and then eventually that'll lead to this big parabolic move to the upside. That is a sign that I would be looking for to think that EGLD might be shifting from a bear market to a bull market. And we haven't seen that yet. With this capitulation, we've moved back down pretty deeply. We're not doing any kind of equal oscillation around zero right now. But if we do start doing that in the coming, weeks, coming months, etc., that might be a sign this is an accumulation zone that, barring any extreme external shocks that could dump the market, might be, EGLD basically kind of gearing itself up for another move to the upside. But we're not there yet. And so what I want to end on with EGLD then is that kind of my outlook on it is that the best we can hope for is sideways action. And I think it's very plausible we see further downside from here, especially if more things blow up in crypto. It's very possible. Then I think the question that anybody interested in EGLD has to ask themselves is, is this the right time to buy, or is it better to wait until there are clearer signs ahead, right? Because one of the things with all these analyses, right, is there's an assumption that's to some degree built in where we, if you're going to be bullish on EGLD, you're to some degree assuming that it'll eventually put in a new all-time high, right? Obviously you could try to do some more short-term trading where you're just trading the short-term volatility. But I think most of the people who are, really EGLD fans are more long-term focused. And so that means that you kind of have to believe it's going to put a new all-time high for that to be reasonable, right? So I think that's the first question that anybody interested in EGLD has to ask themselves is, do you think it's going to be able to put in a new all-time high eventually, right? Is it going to be able to survive this crypto winter? Is, the Elrond team, do they have enough funding? Is there enough that's there to let them keep building through the bear market that will let them, go and potentially reap the rewards in the bull market? And then also, are they going to be able to position themselves in a way that's beneficial enough that they're going to be the ones to reap benefit in the next bull market instead of all these newcomers that are surely going to pop up who, as we've seen in most crypto market cycles, oftentimes the assets that perform the best, think like Solana, not so much currently, but in the bull run it did extremely well. That only existed in that cycle, right? It was a newcomer to the space and it did super well. That's the other thing you have to ask is, do you think EGLD is good enough that when we have all these new players, which also are going to have new tech, probably pretty impressive tech, is its tech good enough and its other value propositions good enough to make it be the thing to really reap the reward versus those other projects? So that's another question that one has to ask oneself when looking at this. And so really what I'm kind of thinking with EGLD here is that one of the things I just want to say is there's no shame of waiting, right? I think that's one of the things with these projects that can be kind of unfortunate is that very strong communities crop up around them, which is not a bad thing. It's great to have a strong community. But one of the things that can be unfortunate about strong communities is that it can lead to this kind of thinking where if you are, a fan of Elrond, that means you have to be buying right now. You have to be buying, you have to be holding, you can't be selling, right? That selling is kind of this disloyal behavior. You're a bad, Elrond fan if you sell. But really, when you think about it rationally, you can be just as much of an Elrond fan holding no EGLD as someone who holds EGLD, right? Your objective evaluation of the project, how strong you think it is, how much you're a fan, that doesn't at all have to be tied to your investment in it, right? You can be a huge fan of Elrond, watch it closely, and have no money in it at all, and wait for a later point to put money in. And that's just something I feel like it just gets lost a lot of times. That oftentimes I feel like people approach these altcoins as thinking, if I like it, I have to be invested in it and I have to hold it, and I can't sell. That's just ridiculous, right? Because, if you're an Elrond fan, but you're at this point and you think that price is going to go down, why should you buy in here and just let that go down? In fact, you should probably just wait until the price is lower, then you have more buying power with whatever money you would have put in. And so that would just be a better investment, ultimately. And so that's just something I wanted to kind of say here at the end, is that, given how bearish things are, in my opinion, there's no shame of just waiting a little bit longer. Who cares if you miss the absolute bottom? Does that really matter? You're going to be that sad if you didn't buy in here, but then you bought here. Or even if you didn't buy in here and you bought here, you're still probably going to be pretty happy with how things fan out or played out. And then what that helps you avoid is the possibility of you buying here thinking that's the bottom, and then you're holding as you're dropping further and further down in price if this bear market continues. So there's just some thoughts, kind of mindset about altcoins. I feel like with altcoins, it can be this kind of situations where people become married to them, or they think that they have to be loyal, that they have to be invested to be in the community. I think that's ridiculous. I think you can be a member of the community, have no money on the table, and just be waiting for fairer pastures to invest, for better times, for more hopeful times to be investing. So again, none of this is financial advice. You should make your own decision if you think now's a good time to buy. If you think it's the bottom, great. By all means, act on it. But in my opinion, I think it's way premature to call this the bottom. And I think at best, we can hope for is sideways chop. And then we have to be on the lookout for potential downside from here. That doesn't mean that Elrond is a bad project. Doesn't mean that it's not going to succeed. It's not going to thrive in the next bull market. What it means in the shorter term is that I think a cautious outlook is reasonable. All right, if you'd like to contact or subscribe to the channel, give the video a like and follow us on Twitter. A lot of updates, better indicators, and more over there.